Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. My name is Nureen Adriana binti Shahriman. My metric number is 12207. So, for the subtopic 23.5, Evolution of Seed Plants, Full Adaptation to Land, will be presented by our Group 9. So, for the learning outcomes, at the end of this subtopic, we should be able to compare and contrast the differences between seed and seedless plants. Then, we can describe different groups of gymnosperms, and also we can identify the key components of gymnosperm and angiosperm's life cycle. For the introduction, seed plants are also called as spermatophytes, vascular plants that use seeds during dispersal stage of their life cycle. As we can see in the diagram, seeds have three main parts, which is embryo, seed coat, cotyledon. So for the embryo, the function embryo will develops from a fertilized egg. Embryo forms epicotyl, which is the first leaf, and then hypocotyl, which will become the stem, and radicle, which become the root. So for the next, it has seed coat. Seed coat function to protect the embryo from harsh conditions. It will keep the embryo from drying out until the condition become favorable to undergo the growth. So the next cotyledon are also called as endosperm, which is it will store food and source of nutrient for the growing seedling after the germination. So it may has additional structures that may help them disperse away from their parents' plants. The structures may help them to travel in the wind or stick to the animals. Seed plants are heterosporous, which having microspores and megaspores. So microspores will become male gymptophytes, which is pollen grains. It also carried by wind or water or pollinators such as butterfly in this diagram, or bees or other insects. So pollination process which occurs when a pollen grain is brought into contact with female gymptophytes through a growing pollen tube. As we can see here in the GIF below, the pollination occurs from the flower 1 to flower 2. The pollinator was the butterfly, which the pollen grain stick on it, and then it brought to the next flower, and then pollination occurs. So for the next, megaspores will develop into a female gymptophyte within an ovule, which is ovule will becomes a seed following fertilization. There are two groups of seed plants. First, gymnosperms, and second, angiosperm. The differences between the two of it are gymnosperm mostly cone-bearing seed plants, while angiosperms are mostly flowering plants. In the gymnosperms, the ovules are not completely enclosed by sporophyte tissue at the time of pollination, while in the angiosperms, the ovules are completely enclosed within diploid sporophyte tissue, which is ovary, which will become the fruit. As we can see in the GIF below, the pollination occurs when the pollen grain stick to the sigma, and then generative cell will go through to the pollen tube, then go to the ovule, which ovule will become the seed, and then the ovary will become the fruit. So if you want to know, the first seed plant was a woody plant named progymnosperms during Devonian period, which will eventually give rise to the gymnosperms. So that's all from me. I will pass to the next presenter. Thank you.
Everyone, my name is Syuhaidah binti Abdul Razak and my metric number is AS12242. There are two types of plant seed, gymnosperm and angiosperm. Gymnosperm then divided into four types, which is conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and gnetophytes. So I will explain the characteristic of each types on next slides. What is gymnosperm? So gymnosperms come from two words, which is gymnos, that means naked, and sperm, that means seed. So these two words represent gymnosperm, that their seeds are not enclosed by fruit, and normally gymnosperm are flowerless plants. The first type of gymnosperm is conifers. Conifers are cone-bearing seed plants, which means it bear cones. So what is cone? Cone is an organ on plants that contains reproductive structures. As you can see in this photo, this is how cone for conifers look like. And we need to remember that other type of gymnosperm also bear cones. Here we can also see that conifers have needle-like leaves that conserve water because they have thick cuticle and recessed stomata. Then conifers are monoecious, which means a single plant of conifers can have both male and female reproductive structure. And one example of conifers is pine, and it have many functions in our daily life. The second type of gymnosperm is cycads. As you can see, cycads have large and divided leaves with unbranched trunk. And for their reproduction, cycads are a bit different from conifers. Like I said before, conifers can have both male and female reproductive structure in one plant, but for cycads, their pollen that will produce male gametes and their seed cones that contain ovule are from different plant of cycads. So the pollen tube from male plant will burst in the area of archegonium, and the sperm will swim to reach an egg on female plant, and the ovule will become seeds when it fertilized by pollen. Next, we have gnetophytes. We know that gnetophytes are gymnosperm, but gnetophytes have numbers of similarity with angiosperm. Some gnetophytes reproduce by producing hecta, and insects will play a role in the pollination of this species, which means the sweet taste of nectar will attract the insects. Then, gnetophytes have similar construction of cone. Here, we need to know that gnetophytes have different cone from other gymnosperm. We know that for other gymnosperm, their male cone will produce male gamete and their female cone contain ovule. But for gnetophytes, both male and female contain bracts. So they don't have archegonia, and archegonia is a female sex organ. Then gnetophytes also have similar structure xylem, and they have leathery leaves that arrange in pairs. The fourth type of gymnosperm is ginkgos. Ginkgos are dioecious, which means a single plant can produce either male or female reproductive structure but not both. Normally, male tree of ginkgos are preferred for planting than female plant. Why? Because female tree have fleshy seed and it will produce smelly smell when it ripen in the fall. The life cycle of ginkgos are same like cycads, where their pollen tube will burst into release and the sperm will swim to egg and they will produce seed. Ginkgos are also resistant to pollution, where we can see they survive well even along the city of street and city park. So we proceed to another type of plant seed, angiosperm. Angiosperm commonly known as flower plant, and it came from two words, angion, which means vessel, and sperma, which means seed. Angiosperm can live in all sorts of habitat from water to desert, such as cactus. The importance of angiosperm in human life is very wide. We can see the tree in tropical forests, the herbaceous plants such as vegetable and herbs and fruit plants are all angiosperm, and their ovules are always enclosed with diploid tissue, and that is why they are known as angiosperm. The origin and radiation of angiosperm. Plants are often eaten or decayed before they can be preserved, so it provides an incomplete fossil record. But recently, one angiosperm fossil was found, and it old 135 million years to the Jurassic. In plant, pollen preserve well than other soft part of plant, so pollen is used to date the appearance of the seed plant. Botanists have come with initiative which is DNA comparison in finding the plant fossil. So they managed to find out another fossil which is Umbrella trichopoda.
Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. My name is Rafhanah Riza with matrix number AS12099. Today I will explain about the life cycle of a pine tree.
Before we start learning about the life cycle of a pine tree, we should know that the reproductive structure of a pine tree are the cones. And since pine trees are monoecious, a single pine tree carries both male and female reproductive structure. As we can see in the diagram, there are two types of cone, which are pollen cone and seed cone. We can think of the pollen cones as the male part of the plant and seed cone as the female part of the plant. So let's take a look at the male part of the plant first. So if we zoom in into the pollen cones, we can see that the pollen cone contains pollen sac or microsporangium. Inside the pollen sac, there are microspore mother cells. So we should note that this part of the diagram that we are looking now are the sporophyte generation, which are diploid. So microspore mother cell will give rise to microspores. And since microspores are haploid, this means that microspore mother cell will undergo meiosis and produce 4 microspores. Each microspore will undergo mitosis and develop into pollen grain. So let's take a look at the female part of the plant. At the female part of the plant, we have seed cone. And if we zoom in into each scale of the seed cone, each scale of a seed cone contains 2 ovules or microsporangium at the upper side of each scale. So inside the microsporangium is the megaspore mother cell. And just like microspore mother cell, megaspore mother cell will undergo meiosis to produce a haploid megaspore. So we should remember that since each scale has 2 ovules, that means there will be 2 megaspore mother cells, and there will also be 2 megaspore. However, only 1 megaspore will undergo mitosis and develop into mature female gametophyte. A mature female gametophyte will contain 2 to 6 argonium,
and each argonium will have large egg cell. So since we have the mature female gametophyte and the pollen grain, the next step is the pollination. So the pollination occurs when the pollen grain reach the megaspore. The pollen grain are dispersed by wind. Once the pollen grain reach the megaspore, the pollen grain will become a mature male gametophyte. So the mature male gametophyte will attach to the megaspore, and a pollen tube will digest its way slowly to the female gametophyte right here. Once it reach the female gametophyte, it will discharge two non-flagellated sperm and it will fertilize one egg cell. Once it fertilizes, it will become the zygote. So the zygote is diploid since the mature male gametophyte is haploid and the mature female gametophyte is haploid. So the zygote will be diploid. Then the zygote will develop by mitosis and become an embryo. The embryo will be coated with seed coat and contain stored food. At this stage, we call it as the seeds. So if we recall, this is called as the seed cone. So the seeds will be found at the seed cone. Once the seeds are mature, the seed cone will dry and open its scales upward. And by time, the seed cone will fall to the ground or germinate by wind. And when it reaches the ground, it will grow into a new pine tree. So that will complete the life cycle of pine tree.
I will be presenting the monocots and eudicots. First, we have to know the cotyledons are. The cotyledons are the seed leaves containing the nutrients that nourish the plant embryo. So when the germination occurs, it becomes the first embryonic leaves of seedling. It also helps the botanist to classify the flowering plants, which is called as angiosperms. The flowering plants are divided by two, which is monocots and eudicots. So first, monocots. Monocots are the shortened by monocotyledons, which is mono means one, and it having a single cotyledons. It was about 65,000 of species, and the examples of monocots are corns and tulips. There are a few of characteristics that can use to identify the monocots. First, the flower. The flower usually have 3 floral parts or multiples of 3. Then, the seed. The seed has only one cotyledon. For the leaves, it has parallel veins of leaves. Then, the roots are fibrous form, and the vascular bundles are complexly arranged, which are not arranged properly. So for the eudicots, it was the shortened by eudicotyledons, which mean eudicots mean true dicot. It is more specific than dicot, which it includes mostly the plants that were traditionally called as dicots. As it also called as dicots, it means it has 2 cotyledons. For examples of eudicots are dandelions and cactus. The characteristic of the eudicots are the floral parts often in multiples of 4 or 5. Then the seed has 2 cotyledons. The leaves are usually in net-like. The root are taproot, while the vascular bundles are arranged in rings. That's all from me. I will pass to the next presenter.
Everyone, my name is Janani and my matrix number is AS12337.
Hi everyone, welcome. And so now I'm going to discuss about the flower and its structures. and also about the flowering plant life cycle which is happening around us. How does a plant reproduce and how a plant can transform from just a small seed to a big one or a very big or large huge tree. So let's discuss about that. Structure of the flower. So if you see this diagram, this is the structure of a flower. First of all, you have to know about the sepals, which is also known as calyx. It can protect the flower bud before the flower opens. This is the sepal, example of a sepal, which protect the plant before the flower blooms. And petals. Petals, of course, all of us would have seen this. This is the petal of plant, which is also used to attract the pollinator. It is diverse in size, shape, and color. And this is the stamen, which consists of anther and filament. Filament is also known as slender stalk and anther is known as sac-like container. And this is the carpel. Finally, we see this is the carpel, which is divided into three types: stigma, style, and ovary. Ovary consists of ovule. And stigma, after the pollen grain, which is the male reproductive part, stick onto it, a pollen will be produced, which connected to the ovule. Later on, we'll see video on this. Sepal. Sepal is a function to provide support and protection for a flower bud as they close up around until it's ready to bloom. So if you see a flower before it blooms, it is covered by flower bud, and after it blooms, it becomes like this. So before a flower blooms, it must be protected by something so that it won't be affected by any insects or anything, wind or any types which can destroy it. And if you see, once the flower has bloomed, this sepal can become thorns like in this plant. This plant is known as genus Cana. This flower has no petals, but the sepals are sharp and serve as protection for the fruit, carrying many seeds. For example, when any insect wants to steal this food or eat this food, it has to overcome this thorn before it eats this food. So as a protection, this sepal can also turn into this kind of thorns. Stamen. Stamen consists of two parts, which is anther and filament. It is actually a male reproductive organ overall, and it is function to produce pollen. You see here, there's a lot of dot types of thing here. It is actually known as pollen grain. Microsporangium, it consists of highly nutritious lining housing diploid pollen cells, and these cells undergo meiosis. These diploid pollen cells in this pollen grain will undergo meiosis and produce 4 haploid cells. These 4 haploid cells will undergo mitosis, which can produce 8 types of pollen grains, and they are termed an immature microgametophyte or pollen grain. After they undergo this process, then we can call it as microgametophyte. Before that, we call it as microsporangium. And these pollen grain are then released, and it is dispersed via wind or maybe the pollinating insect or birds, which can transfer them onto the stigma. Carpel. Carpel is a female reproductive part of a flower, which you can see here. There are 3 types of carpel here. This is centrally located and consists of swollen base. You see, this is the swollen base, this is the swollen base, and this is the swollen base, which contains some potential seeds. Like this is where the main process will take place in the flowers, and it encloses one or more ovules. Like it consists of more than one type of ovule. It depends on the flower because each flower has different properties. The petals. Petals is actually a modified leaf that surround the reproductive part of flowers, and it is often bright colored or unusually shaped to attract the pollinators. If you see here, there are lots and lots of beautiful color of flowers in this world, and maybe this bee could be the one who is attracted to the yellow color, or maybe the how the structure of the flower it is, maybe because different pollinators are attracted to different types of petals of the flowers. And if you see here, this is an example of a bee grabbing fruit from the flower just because it is attracted to the temperature of the flower, because it's light colored, so its temperature is a bit warmer than the others, so that's how the bee is attracted to it. So let's look at it. If you see here, see it's so attracted, it's grabbing food in it from it. So let's move on to the flowering plant life cycle. You see here, this is the beginning of the plant process. From this flower, it is consists of this stamen and carpel. So these both react cooperatively with each other to produce the seed, which comes from the embryo. Okay, so this is the pollen sac inside the anther. There are 4 types of pollen sac in the anther, and in each pollen sac there is microspore mother cell which will undergo meiosis and produce microspores, 4 microspores. And if you look into this part, which is this part, it has a megaspore mother cell which undergo meiosis. This meiosis can produce 4 types of cell, which is 1 megaspore and 3 megaspore. But in this 4 megaspore, only 1 megaspore are able to survive, and these 3 megaspore will disintegrate. And as a result, only 1 megaspore will live, and this will undergo mitosis. Same to this process, these microspores will also undergo mitosis and becomes pollen grain. This one will undergo mitosis and forms 3 antipodal cells, 2 polar nuclei, and 1 egg cell with 2 synergid cells. Actually, this synergid cell is actually something that can provide nutrient to this egg cell. This part is actually taking place in this part, and this one is actually taking place at this part now. So this one will then transferred by the pollinators or maybe wind, and it can fly and stick onto the stigma. After it stick onto this stigma will automatically produce a pollen tube which goes down to the ovary that has a micropyle here. If you see this here, this is actually the opening of the ovary that able the pollen tube to go inside of it and release the 2 types of cell here, tube cell and germinal cell, into this. And then after these 2 enter this ovule, the 2 cells of pollen grain enter this ovule, double fertilization will take place. As a result of this double fertilization, endosperm and embryo will be produced, and as they mature they become a seed, or eventually they can also become a fruit, and finally fruit or flower. They can become a fruit or flower at the end of the cycle. So that's the end of the plant life cycle. See, the flowering plants consist of 2 types of spore, which is megaspore and microspore. This megaspore is located in the ovule within an ovary. If you see here, this is the carpel, right? So inside the carpel got ovule, ovary, style, and stigma. So here is where the megaspore is located. Here, this one. You see, okay? And one megaspore develops into embryo sac, which is consists of 7 cells. The megaspore develops into an embryo sac, which becomes 7 cells. How can it become into 7 cells. Later on we can watch the video for better understanding. But one of it is an egg and another two are polar nuclei. Okay. This is a microspore which is produced within the anthers that becomes pollen grain as it matures. You see here, this is the anther, right? Inside the filament, filament is this part, the stalk. This is the dot-like kinda thing, which consists of 4 parts. These 4 parts is produced within anthers that becomes pollen grain as it matures. This matured pollen grain has 3 cells, which are 2 sperm cells and 1 tube cell. This one pollen in this pollen cell, there's a lot of pollen grains. These pollen grains consists of 3 cells, which is 2 sperm cell and 1 tube cell.
The adult sporophyte, the pine tree, develops male and female cones on separate branches. Female cones develop 2 ovules on the upper surface of each cone scale. Each ovule contains haploid megaspores. Male cones produce microspores by meiosis. The microspores develop into pollen grains. Each winged pollen grain is a 4-celled male gametophyte.
How does a megaspore can develop into an embryo sac which consists of 7 cells? As we have discussed in the earlier slides, the embryo sac consists of 7 cells, right? So how it is becoming into from 1 cell into 7 cells? So let's look into a video for a more and clear vision.
The surviving megaspore expands and undergoes 3 rounds of mitosis to produce 8 haploid nuclei. As the nuclei have not developed any individual division, they initially share the same cytoplasm. This complete structure is known as the embryo sac.
Pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is something that is transferring the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the carpel. How is this happening? First, after the microspores develop into the male gametophytes, which is also known as the pollen grains, because the microspores will develop into male gametophyte in the male reproductive part, which is the anther. And after that, this pollination, which is the transportation of pollen from the anther to the stigma of a carpel. After these pollen grains stick onto the stigma, a pollen tube is produced. This pollen tube will carry 2 sperm to the micropyle of an ovule. Micropyle is actually the opening of the ovule that can able the 2 sperm to enter the ovary.
To reach the embryo sac, a pollen grain must land on the stigma. Once landed, it begins to germinate. The tube cell forms a long structure down the style and into the ovary. The generative cell travels behind the tube cell nucleus.
Double fertilization. What is double fertilization? It is actually a one sperm that unites with an egg, forming a diploid zygote. Like how it happens in a human cell, in human reproductive part, that's in the ovary, in the female. That's how it also happens in the flower. See, if you see when the sperm unites with this egg, it can form the diploid zygote, and others unite with pollen nuclei, forming a triple endosperm nucleus. Like when this thing will unite with this polar nuclei, this is called as polar nuclei, it can form a triploid endosperm nucleus, which consists of 1, 2, 3 dots with 3 nucleus. Let's look into more.
In the ovary, it divides by mitosis to produce 2 haploid sperm cells. The pollen tube reaches the micropyle and releases the sperm cells into the embryo sac. One of the two sperm cells fertilizes the egg cell. This produces a diploid zygote, which will become the embryo. The other sperm cell moves up and fuses with both of the central nuclei, forming a triploid cell. This unusual triploid cell develops into an endosperm and serves as the embryo's food supply during early development.
Okay. On the previous video, we saw the double fertilization. As a result of the double fertilization, the ovule there in the ovary will then turn into the seed, which is, we can also call it a seed coat. And the embryo, which is the flesh in the fruit. Embryo is actually the flesh in the fruit. Like in the fruit, there's flesh which will be eaten by us, and that is actually the embryo of the process. And the endosperm, this endosperm is then absorbed by the cotyledons, or it might be digested as it matures. It depends on the type of fruit and plants. And finally, the fruit itself is derived from the ovary, the whole thing, ovary, and we call it as a fruit. So that is the end of the slide. Thank you.
So lastly, we will learn about flowers and diversification. So as we know, flowers are majorly involved in reproduction of plants. So to ensure a successful sexual reproduction of plant, the plant require an effective way for its seeds and pollen to be dispersed. Since there are many ways that the pollen and seeds can be dispersed, flowers have adapted to many different types of flowers. The flowers can be categorized into wind-pollinated flowers, insect and bird-pollinated flowers, and lastly fruits. So just like the name, the pollen of wind-pollinated flowers are dispersed by the wind. Since the pollen are dispersed by wind and the flower does not have to attract any animals or insects, the flowers are usually not showy. They don't have any bright petals color or any aromas. So next, insect and bird pollinated flowers. So since insect and bird pollinated flowers have to attract their pollinators, this type of flower have adapted to attract specific pollinators. How do they adapt to attract specific pollinators? Some of the flower produce nectar and have colorful flowers. For example, this flower have a bright yellow color and produces nectar. Bees will come to the flower to collect nectar, and the pollen of the flower will stick to the body of the bee. When the bee fly to another flower, it will bring the pollen of the first flower with it, and the pollen will transfer to the second flower when the bee landed on the second flower. Other than producing nectar and have colorful flower petals, insect and bird pollinated flowers also do sexual mimicry to attract other insects. They will imitate the shape or the look of a female insect in order to attract the male insect to the flower. So when the male insect came to the flower, the seed or the pollen of the flower will then attach to the body of the insect. And when the insect are frustrated that the flower is actually not the female insect, it will fly to another flower and bring the seed or the pollen attached to the body to another flower. This video shows how sexual mimicry of a flower works. So we can see here that the seed of the plant are actually attached to the insect. And lastly, fruits. So the fruits of the flowers protect and aid in the dispersal of seed. So how does fruits aid in the dispersal of seed? The dispersal of seed occur when the seeds are transported to another location by wind, gravity, water, or animals. When the flower have developed into a fruit, the seeds of the flower will be inside the fruit. So when an animal eat the fruit, the seed will be transported to a new location and animals will deposit the seed when they deficit. That's all from our group. Thank you.